Good evening, doctors, and welcome. My name is Mitch Braunstein. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation on dental office lease negotiations. The purpose of tonight's program is to discuss commercial lease agreements, specifically why the lease agreement is so important to you as a dentist. Now, whether you are looking at opening a new practice, planning on renewing your current office lease, or for those of you getting closer to retirement and would like to know how this is applicable to the sale of your practice, all of the information is applicable. Very important that all of the language in the office lease, in addition to the economic terms, best reflects the terms of our tenancy and does not expose us to certain aspects of liability that may act as a detriment to yourselves as business owners as well as dentists. For example, right now I'm sitting on the 18th story of a very large commercial office tower, and if the landlord here were to serve us with a notice to ever leave the building because they perhaps plan on redeveloping the property, well, it's not that big of an issue, as we here could pick up our desks, our computers, and we could be out by the weekend. Not at all the same for a dentist. Since dentistry is such a very capital-intensive industry, if you were served with a redevelopment notice, the impact to your business would be significant. I mean, the cost alone to close down the practice, find new space, and build out a new clinic is unfortunately a reality that some doctors are faced with quite often. And that does happen when you have an unfavorable lease agreement in place. Now, just to provide you all with a little bit more information on Cirrus if you're not familiar, Cirrus was founded a little over 2 decades ago. We, on an annual basis, review roughly 1,000 lease documents for dentists every year. Now, out of those 1,000 lease documents that we do review, we get retained roughly by half of those doctors to negotiate on their behalf, to represent them in negotiations against or with a landlord. Now, since our company's inception about 1.5 years ago, we reached a landmark of having represented roughly 10,000 doctors and negotiated our 10,000th lease. Again, that's just about 1.5 years ago now, so very proud of that landmark. In addition to offering a lease negotiation service, we speak publicly at some engagements that perhaps some of you have seen myself or some colleagues speak at. For example, the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the Yankee Dental Conference as well, the ODA. We are a fully CE accredited company, and this is a CE accredited course. So for those of you who are joining us here tonight, we will be emailing over a CE credit to your email address. For those of you who don't see it emailed out, it does take sometimes between 4 to 5 business days, and please be sure to check your junk folders if it's not in your direct inbox. Now, just as this field is populating, it's outlining a number of clients that we've worked with across the country. We don't just represent doctors in lease negotiations in the United States, but we also work with a number of clients in Canada as well. Perhaps a colleague of yours, their name might populate on the screen there, but we do represent doctors in lease negotiations with landlords large and small, negotiating on behalf of clients who are perhaps tenants of some of the larger real estate investment trusts, or tenants to perhaps landlords that are smaller mom and pop shop landlords. The purpose of tonight's course is to discuss the true importance of the office lease for you all as dentists, go through some of the key components that will help you grow and protect and eventually sell the clinic. And finally, to discuss an action plan, some truly practical tips for you to consider when looking to either negotiate with your current landlord or new potential landlord. Towards the latter half of the course, we will get to some of the tactics that we use here in-house to negotiate on behalf of our clients. And I will set aside about 10 minutes towards the end of the course should any of you have questions. So there's going to be a Q&A session, And if there's questions specific to your situation, at the end of the course, you can feel free to enter into the chat box some questions that you may have. So why is the lease document so important to you as a dentist? Well, namely, it should provide you and the practice with a very long-term and stable commitment. This will offer the practice a great deal of security. Now, for those of you looking to lease new office space, we do often recommend that it is best for us to have an initial 10-year term with multiple options to renew. Ideally 2 or 3 5-year options to renew the lease agreement so that we can extend its life when it reaches the expiry of its initial term. Very important that we have it set up like that so A, we have predictability and stability for the practice as we're tenants, but also if we're to sell the practice, very important that the person who would purchase the clinic from us have term that can be transferred to them. The lease agreement should also provide the practice with a degree of minimized risk and exposure. For example, if you're looking to lease new office space, very common for a landlord to request that you provide a personal guarantee or outline yourselves on the lease document as a guarantor. Ideally, we should structure the tenancy of a lease contract under that of a professional corporation so that if we're ever to be in default of the lease agreement or in a dispute with the landlord, if the landlord were to seek damages from the tenant, they would be limited to seeking damages from that of the professional corporation, any of the assets that are listed under that of the PC, the LLC, the S-Corp, whatever it may be. If we have to provide a guarantee to the landlord, there's essentially 2 ways that the landlord will request a guarantee, and it will be outlined on the lease agreement. One is what's referred to as a conditional guarantee, and second is an unconditional guarantee. Now, a lot of the more business-savvy landlords will request an unconditional guarantee and have their tenants provide an indemnity or an unconditional guarantee, essentially exposing that of the tenant's personal assets. So if you have to sign the lease agreement personally to outline that guarantee, or if you signed the agreement as the tenant in your individual name, that's not an ideal situation because in that sense, now we've essentially opened up all of our personal assets to that of the landlord. So anything we've signed under our personal names, our house, our car, anything like that. Much more advisable for us to actually structure the lease agreement, again, under a professional corporation, limit any kind of guarantee that the landlord would ask for, and be sure that we're not exposing the practice to any kind of undue risk and liability. Again, that's something that's much more common for someone who's looking to sign a new lease document. For those of us who have been practicing for a number of years now, it's not at all reasonable for the landlord to still request that we provide ourselves as the guarantors on a lease document. The lease document should also provide us with a great deal of flexibility. Now, flexibility for the practice is also very important because when we're looking to sell the clinic and transfer the lease document to somebody else that would take over the practice, if there's a degree of flexibility outlined in the lease, it can provide the sale value of the clinic with an increase. Furthermore, throughout our tenancy in the office space, whether it's medical office space or retail office space, if there's certain tools in the lease agreement that can allow us to exercise some aspects of flexibility, it's much more advantageous. For example, if we have what's referred to as a right of first refusal included in the lease, the right of first refusal will provide us with the option to expand our office space and our square footage should there ever be a unit adjacent to us that becomes available. So I was speaking with a doctor yesterday who's leasing office space, and the unit adjacent to him is about 1,000 square feet, and it's available. It's sitting vacant right now on the marketplace. The landlord is trying to lease that space out at a much higher rental rate than this doctor pays today. If that doctor had the right of first refusal in his lease agreement, the landlord would be inclined to offer that adjacent space to this specific dentist to expand his practice square footage and perhaps include either one or two more operatories for the clinic in that new adjacent space. But unfortunately, if we don't have flexible terms in the lease document to provide us with those options, then the landlord is not obligated to provide us with such an opportunity. The lease agreement should also provide us with a certain amount of fair and affordable financial terms. Now, for those of us who are on a lease agreement or structured under the lease agreement, and it's referred to as the triple net lease, or actually there's basically two types of lease documents that we would have signed. One is what's referred to as the gross lease, whereby both our base rent and our additional expenses, so the taxes, the maintenance, and insurance on the space are all covered in one gross payment that we would pay the landlord on a monthly basis. Now, most of us, as the triple net lease is new to real estate over the past 20, 25 years, we will have to pay the landlord our base rental rate, which we'll be able to anticipate every month throughout the term, but we will also have to pay the landlord additional costs. So proportionate shares of what our taxes, our maintenance, and our insurance, or our common area maintenance costs for the property and the rent expense would be. Very important to be sure that we have affordable financial terms and include the ability to receive very detailed operating cost statements if we're structured under the triple net lease, so that for all those additional rent statements and rent obligations that we have to pay the landlord, we actually know what we're paying for. Because for the base rental rate, as much as we know how much the rent is going to be throughout the term, very important that as it relates to the additional rent, we absolutely know what we're paying for. And in addition to receiving those operating cost statements, we should actually have the right to audit those statements. So should there ever be a discrepancy with the amount that we think we have to pay the landlord in rent, we now have the option to incur a third-party auditor, review the landlord's books, and make sure that we're not overpaying for anything. Because the last thing that we want to do as a business owner is overspend in rent. If we're looking to lease new office space, very strategic that we don't agree to a lease term that's going to have us overspend in rent. There's a few strategic clauses in the lease agreement, a few economic terms that can provide us with a certain subsidy. Now, if we're looking to lease new office space, we need to be sure that we're not spending on rent throughout the amount of time that we're trying to build the office. So if it takes us 4 to 6 months to actually construct the office space, we should have what's referred to as a fixturing period or a rent-free period, whereby we can build out the office space but not have to pay rent. We should also request what's referred to as a tenant improvement allowance or a construction allowance, so that if we're going to be investing a very large sum of money into the office space, because it does cost roughly $100 to $150 a square foot to build out an office, and that's not even including the expense on equipment, we should request that the landlord provide us with a certain amount of capital to assist in building out that space. Because at the end of the day, we can't take the plumbing, the electrical, and the leasehold improvements that are going to stay attached to the building. That improvement is going to benefit the landlord because now they have a fully built out and plumbed out dental office. They should have to assist us in actually spending on that build out. A lot of brokers, if they mention the fact that the landlord should provide us with a tenant improvement allowance, they may not discuss the reality that that amount of money the landlord would provide us with in upfront cost to build out the space is actually recaptured. Landlords aren't in the business of providing us with free money. They'll happily assist us to build out the space, but they'll include that expense by way of a loan in the back half of the lease term in the rent clause. So we just need to be sure that it makes the most amount of sense for us when we're looking to lease new space. The lease agreement should also provide us with the complete ability to sell the clinic. we're going to discuss the very specific clause that provides us with the option to actually transfer the lease and go through a smooth transition. But there's certain terms in the lease agreement that should provide us with an enhanced saleability of the practice. We should be sure that there's no aspects of risk and liability that would be included in a lease document that could be reviewed by somebody who's looking to purchase a practice and now give them a reason to try to negotiate a reduced sale price. For example, if there's a demolition clause included in a lease document and some associate doctor is looking at purchasing a practice that's for sale, if they see that there's a demolition clause included in the lease agreement, it would be advantageous on their end to at least try to negotiate down the purchase price of that practice that would be listed for sale. It would be advantageous because what doctor would want to buy a practice that's in a building that could potentially be torn down by the landlord? All the terms in the lease agreement should provide us with the ability to sell the practice, act as an assist, not a detriment when we're looking to eventually retire and transition from the clinic. I'm just going to pose a question for us all now to think about quickly. This chart here, it represents the three factors that build up a value of a dental clinic. So keep in mind that this pie chart is not at all proportionate, but the three main factors that determine the overall appraised value of a practice are A, its equipment, B, its goodwill and its patient charts, and C, its real estate asset. So for those of us that lease office space, the value of the real estate asset will be determined based on the value of the lease. So my question to everyone is, how much do we think the lease agreement can determine the value of a practice? Keeping in mind that the pie chart is not at all proportionate, would I surprise any of you by outlining the fact that the lease can actually determine as much of 100% of what your practice may be worth? Again, if there's a demolition clause in the lease agreement and a purchasing doctor sees that, the sale of the practice is not going to be as attractive, or rather the purchase, because there's certain terms in the lease agreement that might not be attractive and might deter somebody from purchasing your clinic. If we don't have the option to actually transfer the lease to somebody that's going to take over the space and hopefully take over the practice, then how could we ever sell the clinic? So the lease agreement in most cases can determine as much of 100% to what the value of the practice will be. And we'll discuss in a couple of quick examples as to why that is. But very important that we just be sure the lease agreement at a point of practice sale is going to, again, assist us throughout that transition and not prohibit us from selling the clinic. We should have the lease agreement designed in such a way that we don't have to structure our practice goals and our career goals around this lease document. The lease document should be structured in such a way that it's going to work around us and what we have planned for the future. Now, there's four basic concepts that we'll go through, and I've talked about just quickly some of the economic factors. These four concepts are things that we should all keep in mind if we have a lease agreement today or we're looking to lease new space, because these four factors not just affect us as tenants, but also as business owners. So in addition to the economic portion of the lease, we also have to have a certain portion of the lease dedicated to protecting us as tenants, and we can see that by way of outlining a very significant term and providing us, again, with the stability of knowing that we can renew the lease beyond its initial term. We should also have flexibility, the ability to transfer the lease document from ourselves, potentially sublease the space to another doctor that may want to rent an operatory from us, and include a death and disability clause. Now, I typically go through the death and disability clause towards the end of the program, but just as it's up now, the death and disability clause provides not only us, but also our estates with the option to terminate the lease document should anything bad happen. So it sounds morbid, I assure you it's not, but If for whatever reason we were no longer able to practice wet finger dentistry, we should have what's referred to as a good guy clause in the lease agreement that would allow us to terminate the continuous liability with the landlord. If we were to develop a back problem, a hand tremor, carpal tunnel syndrome, or if, God forbid, we were to pass away, the rent obligation does not stop. We need a tool, a function in the lease that will allow us to discontinue the rent that's due every 30 days. And we, I'm actually very proud to say, had pioneered this provision, the death and disability clause, a number of years ago, whereby should anything unfortunate happen, both you and your estates should have the ability to terminate the document if anything unfortunate were to happen. Something that needs to be very clearly explained throughout the negotiation, but just very important that we have included. Now, the fourth concept to be aware of in the lease agreement is this aspect of risk. I've alluded to and mentioned a couple of times some provisions that could pose certain risks to us as business owners. One, again, the demolition clause. If there's a demolition clause in the lease agreement, that will provide the landlord with the option to actually terminate our tenancy, provide us with a certain amount of notice to have to move out, whereby they can tear down the building. It's much more common for those of us in urban areas where there's a lot of real estate development. In older buildings where landlords plan on holding on to their assets so they can sell the building to real estate developers, demolition clauses are very valuable to landlords, but in our case as dentists, not at all something that we should be exposed to. It's a major risk. The relocation clause is another major risk, and I had mentioned that just when starting off the webinar by providing the example that right now, again, I am on the 18th story of a very large commercial office tower. Now, for a typical office tenant, or most even retail tenants, for those tenants to be served with a relocation notice, that might not affect or risk those business types as much as it would a dentist. A dentist spends a tremendous amount of money building out the office space, but it's not just the value in the leasehold improvements and the tangible items that have been built into the four walls that you call the practice home that could cost us a lot of money, but the risk in having to shut down the practice and close the practice doors for a certain amount of time and have to move our location from one end of the shopping plaza all the way to the other can provide us with a great deal of risk. The relocation clause, there's a certain degree of language that the landlord will have included in a relocation clause. If a relocation clause exists in your lease agreement today, it should, at the very minimum, provide us with a certain amount of notice. Most relocation clauses are structured under a 30-day notice. It takes a lot longer for us to build out a new dental office than 30 days. It's also going to cost us a tremendous amount of money to actually build out that new space, but that's not an expense that we should have to pay for. The landlord should have to pay for it. The new practice space should be built and ready, and we should only have to move from our current location to the new space that would be built one day after our notice. We shouldn't have to be exposed to the risk of closing our practice doors for a certain amount of time. The biggest risk in a relocation clause is patient attrition. If at any time we have to close the patient doors and now we have clients of ours that can't come to the clinic, it's going to be a detriment to not only the gross production for the practice, but for the overall success of the business. I have an example provision up on the screen right now. This clause is the option to renew. Again, I had briefly mentioned it earlier throughout the presentation, but basically the option to renew clause outlines our ability as tenants to renew the office lease for a certain amount of term. This is beyond the initial lease term and provides us as tenants the ability to actually continue the life of the lease for a certain amount of time. A lot of people need to be aware of the fact that there will be a notification deadline whereby we have to let the landlord know we do intend to exercise our option to renew. If we pass that deadline, as unfortunately a lot of doctors do pass that deadline, the option to renew will not apply to you anymore. So we need to not only be very aware of when our actual lease expiry is, but also when our notification deadline is. If we pass the notification deadline and the landlord is aware of that, and then we reach out to the landlord to begin the negotiation process, the leverage that the tenant has significantly diminished at that point in time, because the landlord knows your ability as a dentist to actually relocate is tremendously low. So if I were a landlord and a dental tenant of mine wanted to actually renew their lease and start the negotiation process post-notification deadline, I would immediately increase the rent rates. What option does a dentist have to move if they've missed their option to renew? There's a number of things in this example option to renew clause that could pose a great deal of difficulty to a dental tenant, and I'm just going to highlight them now. Or excuse me, they're not highlighted, but just in this example provision, there's a number of key sentences here that could specifically affect us as dental tenants. And if you just read along with me carefully, in the first sentence, we notice that the option to renew clause states, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease, we can already see an issue. The provision started to read off by saying, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. Well, what if I'm towards my retirement and I'm hoping to assign my lease to somebody? I only have 2 years left of term, but I'm not going to be the doctor who takes over the space. If I'm Dr. Joe Black and I'm assigning my lease agreement to somebody, selling my clinic, and I'm hoping that these options to renew would apply to somebody who's taking over my space, well, based on the way that this option to renew clause has been worded, it doesn't apply. Very important that these options to renew be transferable so that they benefit someone, a purchasing doctor, who would look to take over the office space. Associate doctor is someone who needs to get financing to be able to afford purchasing a practice, will need roughly between 7 to 10 years of lease term to be able to afford the purchase of the practice. That amount of lease term is going to determine the amortization period that the bank or lending institution would draw up when they're going through the financing process. So for example, if I'm leasing office space, I have 2 years left on my lease contract, but I have 2 5-year options to renew. It's not a total of 12 years of lease term that I can transfer to someone. If my options to renew are structured in such a way that this clause, this example clause is, then I will actually only have 2 years of lease term that could be transferred to somebody that would take over my office space. We need to be sure that the option to renew clause is transferable so that an associate doctor that would look to purchase our practice won't have to go through the issues of getting approved for financing. If we continue to read along, the provision reads that as the tenant, and if tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default, it shall have the option to renew this lease. Funny thing about the word default is that it's capitalized. This is Contract Law 101, but in any contract where there is a term that's capitalized, aside from a name, it means that it's been prior defined in the definition section of the contract. So in this case, default would have been prior defined in the lease agreement. And most default provisions can stretch between 1 to 4 pages. And if this tenant, if Dr. Joe Black had found himself in default ever throughout the lease term, the option to renew would not apply to him. So even if he had missed his rent payment by 1 day, he could now have been in default, and the option to renew may not apply to him when looking to renew the term of the lease agreement. The default provision continues to read that it shall have been the option to renew this lease for a further term of 5 years exercisable by written notice to the landlord no less than 9 months to the end of the term. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease at a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant. Now there's two issues here. One is the fact that when Dr. Joe Black is looking to renew his lease agreement, it's going to be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. The landlord's then current standard form lease is not defined. That then current standard form lease can mean whatever the landlord wants it to. If Dr. Joe Black had done a fantastic job at negotiating the relocation clause, the demolition clause, all of the detrimental provisions in the lease agreement out of the agreement as he signed the initial term, if this option to renew wasn't properly structured, then the landlord would have the option to put a completely new document in front of Dr. Joe Black, and he would have to sign that if he wanted to continue occupying the space. We need to be sure that nothing can change when we're looking to renew the lease agreement. The rental rates in most commercial office leases will increase. We should look to negotiate what the increase will be when we sign the initial term. But in this case, the rent is going to continue to increase, and it's at the landlord's judgment as to what it's going to be. If the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on the market rent within 60 days of the exercise by the tenant of its option to renew, the rent shall be then determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. The problem there lies within the sentence, but if Dr. Joe Black has to compare his rent to perhaps a Starbucks that had taken office space a year ago, but Dr. Joe Black had been in the office space for now going on 2 decades, it's going to be an issue. The Starbucks is capable of paying much more rent, and his then rent would have to be compared to the amount of retail rent that the Starbucks is paying, and an issue when we're looking to renew the lease agreement, because landlords at that point in time are very concerned with increasing their tenants' anticipated rents. If our lease agreement comes up for expiry, we should look to begin the negotiation process, ideally 24 months before that date is, or even 24 months before our option to renew deadline is. And that's because for us as tenants, we're never going to have as much leverage as we would at that point in time. If we're looking to lease new office space, all of these terms should be negotiated prior to actually signing the document. And before we go through a transition and assign the lease agreement, we should look to have the lease agreement negotiated before an associate doctor or someone purchasing the practice could turn away from the potential sale. Now, as it relates to an assignment and a potential sale of the practice, we have here the assignment provision. It's commonly also referred to as the transfer provision, but it basically outlines our ability as tenants to transfer the office lease from ourselves to somebody else that would take over the office space. Now, particular to us all as dentists, this can determine our ability to actually sell the practice. Because if we can't transfer the office lease, we can sell the practice for its parts, its goodwill, its patient charts, and its equipment, but we can't sell it as a whole. And the most profitable way to sell a practice, to sell a dental clinic, is to manage the sale of the clinic by way of selling its entirety, selling its patient charts, its equipment, and assigning the lease agreement to someone that would take over the space. To go throughout the assignment, we need to receive the landlord's consent in order to do so. If you read along in this example provision, this clause reads, if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. We have our first issue. It's trying to receive the consent of the landlord. If we don't receive the consent of the landlord to transfer the lease agreement, we're going to have an issue actually transferring the document to the incoming doctor. Any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate this lease or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the leased premises. Two issues. If the lease agreement is terminated by the landlord just upon our mere request to actually transfer the lease document, we won't be able to sell the clinic. If the landlord has the option to increase the rent rates, if I'm a purchasing doctor, I'm looking to take over a practice, if all of a sudden I see that the rent is going to go up substantially because the landlord has the option to do so, I'm going to turn away from that deal. I wouldn't want to take over a practice where the rent had just increased because I'm going to be coming into the space. It's not advantageous. Landlords want that flexibility because then they know that they can lease out built-out office space. They try to include the rent at a premium, but for the doctors looking to sell their practices, it's much better and it's much more advised that we actually manage the control and transfer of the lease and sale of the practice, and we don't allow the landlord to get involved in the sale process at all. Unfortunately, landlords a lot of the time will use this consent language to try to leverage collecting a portion of what the practice would sell for, because they can argue that they won't provide a tenant with consent in a lease transfer unless the tenant provides them a portion of what their business would sell for. I was working with a doctor last week in Milwaukee. He was looking to purchase a practice in medical office space, and in the lease proposal that he had received, it was specifically written into the agreement that in the assignment clause, if the business owner or the tenant ever wanted to transfer their lease agreement, the landlord would be entitled to collect 50% of what that doctor would purchase the practice for. We had to point this out to our client, and in the negotiation, the conference call with our lease negotiator, the doctor, and the landlord, it was very, very simply outlined the fact that our client would love to take over the space, but we just need to amend this assignment language. The landlord very openly said no. When the business owner looks to sell their practice, their business in the future, he does plan on collecting half of what it would sell for. And their argument behind that is because everything that's been built out into the unit and the value behind the location, the leasehold improvements, etc., is something that the landlord owns. So if somebody's trying to sell something that the landlord owns, then they should be entitled to a portion of what that business would sell for. Obviously, that's completely unreasonable, and we had to advise our client not to take over that space, but it's language like that that we need to be very aware of. It's language like that that could potentially harm us from going through the retirement process. Now, this provision continues to read, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Now, if we've signed the lease agreement under our personal name, if the person or the doctor that would take over our office space, if they default on rent, the landlord can still hold us on the hook for any missed payments of rent, not just for the previous months, but for the remainder of the term. The last thing that we want to do when we sell the practice and transfer the lease is have to look in the rear view and worry about the person who just purchased the practice from us. We need to discontinue the liability and be sure that the landlord doesn't have a reason or an ability to one day call us because the associate doctor couldn't run a business, and now we're still on the hook to have to come back and potentially practice. We need to be sure that all of the liability is discontinued at a point of sale. We had talked about the relocation right, and this clause here is basically broken down to outline some of the criteria. If we just read along, and in the interest of time, we'll do so quickly, To the extent required in landlord's reasonable judgment to accommodate an expansion or reconfiguration of the center or an expansion by a major occupant, landlord shall have the right to relocate the premises to another part of the center in accordance with the following criteria. Now let's take a look at the criteria. It says here that the new premises shall be substantially the same in size. Funny thing about the word substantially, it's not capitalized. The landlord could move us to space that's 1,500 square feet larger, or he could move us to space that's on the far end of the shopping plaza next to the dumpster and is 500 square feet less. Now, if he moves us to the space that's larger, our rent's going to go up. If he moves us to the space that's a little bit smaller, we might lose an operatory. The physical relocation of the premises shall be accomplished by landlord at landlord's cost. The physical relocation should be very, very clearly defined, because typically in a relocation clause, you'll see a limit on the expense that the landlord is exposed to, and in this case, it's not to exceed $1,000. That's probably going to cover the cost of labor to move the equipment from site A to site B. We need to be sure that the expense in building out new office space at the very minimum is covered 100% by the landlord. If we're exposed to a relocation clause, we need to be sure that the landlord is responsible again for being sure that the new space we'd have to move into is 100% comparable in desirability. It's no different by 5% larger or smaller than our current office space, and the landlord should have to pay for 100% of the move. Ideally, the relocation clause is not in our lease, but for those of us in a shopping center, it's something that's a little difficult to get out of the agreement. We've been very successful at negotiating the relocation clause out of the lease, but for some of us today that are exposed to that liability, there's certain degrees of remedying that can be done to just protect us if the landlord did ever opt to relocate us. Now, there's a number of other provisions in the lease agreement. Obviously, given the amount of time, we don't have the luxury to go through all of them. Termination rights on the landlord end can be an issue. We need to be very aware of the subordination clause if the property were to ever be foreclosed upon. Just some of you may be familiar there with a few of them if you have an office lease and you're familiar with some of the terms. But we've gone through a couple of the major provisions in a lease that can affect us, and timing in the agreement is everything. So for those of you who do have a lease in place and perhaps did not connect with appropriate representation when looking to negotiate the lease, when taking over the space, it's not at all to say that the lease cannot be fixed, because in a negotiation and in commercial real estate, timing truly is everything. For those of you who have an option to renew coming up, I want to talk about this next slide, the tenant lease cycle. If we were to reach out to the landlord two weeks or even 2 months before the lease expires, our option to actually negotiate with the landlord and our leverage from the tenant's perspective is significantly decreased. And that's decreased because, again, if we reach out to the landlord in that amount of time, they're smart. They realize that for you as a dentist, you can't just pick up the business and move it so easily. They realize that you're tied to the foundation that is your business, and that's everything that's built up to make it what it is. If we reach out to the landlord, ideally 2 years before it expires, or before we have that option to renew deadline, we as tenants now have a great deal of leverage to start negotiating with the landlord. If we reach out to the landlord with that amount of time, the first thing that pops up in the back of their heads is the fact that you might actually be considering a relocation. If we reach out to the landlord with a significant amount of time, they realize that you could be looking for new office space, going through the process of determining what the zoning and permitting is on more appropriate office space perhaps, and looking at new potential sites that could be a better home for your clinic. And it would incentivize and make the landlord very motivated to open up the lease agreement and negotiate some of the terms that are very important to us as dentists. So if we're not familiar today as to what our actual expiry is for the lease agreement, important that we're just aware of when those dates are, those critical dates. And now the final thing that I wanted to go through is the tactical plan that we have here at Cirrus. We call it the Cirrus Wheel. And it's just an overall process that we use when negotiating on behalf of our clients with a landlord. So the first step is being sure that we've gathered all the proper documentation, not just a copy of the original lease, but all the additional addendums, amendments, riders, estoppel certificates, etc., to be sure that even if we just had an original lease agreement, some landlords very smartly will try to negotiate changes or will sneak in changes in their option clauses or their amendment agreements, but we need to have all of the proper documentation because all of the lease documents paint a picture, a technical picture in terms of what had actually happened between the tenant and the landlord. We need to properly assess what our personal and professional goals are so that we can start to strategize a negotiation strategy and have things that are important in place to negotiate for when looking to make some changes to the agreement. We need to be sure that we're very aware of what the certain risks are, because some risks for us as doctors looking to lease new space may not be as important for those of us looking to actually sell the practice and transition from the clinic. So we just need to appropriately see the certain amount of specificity and things that are personal to us. And again, have a very clear-cut negotiation strategy in line with what our practice goals are. Now we have to do a lot of research on the market. We have to conduct some very thorough fair market rental rate research to determine what the going rates are for comparable properties nearby, so that when it comes time to talk about the economics for the renewal, we're very aware of what we should be discussing with the landlord. If we approach the landlord and we start to talk about the rent rates, but we don't know what the fair market rent rate is, and we haven't done our research on comparable properties nearby, very difficult for us to have an intelligent conversation backed up by science in terms of what the rent rate should be for not only the next 1 or 2 years, but for the next 5 years, the next potential 10 years, or the option to renew. And what have we not done in these first 4 steps? We haven't even reached out to the landlord yet. We've just been preparing and planning for that initial call. And then we reach out to the landlord. And on that first call, most often we start the conversation by talking about what landlords care about most, and that's money, that's rent. And that's when the formal negotiation process begins, and the whole back and forth with the landlord is conducted. And depending on our timing, it can be a very lengthy back and forth negotiation, sometimes strategically done so given the timing for your renewal, or sometimes it has to be taken and conducted very quickly. But that process, that step 6, can take a number of months or weeks. The lease negotiation terms, so not just talking about now the economic portion of the lease agreement, but also, again, the legal terms. Some examples that we went through earlier through tonight's course. We need to be sure that we have very specific language that best reflects the terms and best reflects the terms of dentistry. I've spoken with some very competent real estate attorneys who think they've negotiated a fantastic dental office lease. But the reality is, if they're not familiar with the way that a dentist runs his or her business, then what good is the real estate language? It needs to be parallel to the language and the specificity of dentistry. And then after that 7th step is conducted, we go through the final review and execution of the lease. Because until we have a duly signed copy of the agreement, both signed by a tenant and a landlord, the lease agreement and the negotiation is not complete. So once that lease is finally negotiated, we have to be sure that the landlord signs off on it, because you wouldn't believe the amount of times we've gone back and forth in a negotiation and a landlord has actually sent us back a copy that was the original lease that we had started off with in the first rounds of negotiation. We need to be sure that everything we've talked about, the economic terms and the legal terms, have all been kept up to date, and the landlord hasn't tried to change anything that perhaps could be missed if we're getting lazy by the time that step 8 comes around. So having said all that, at a high level, that's the process that we take for dealing for some doctors that are looking to lease new space, renew their space, and again, if we're getting towards that point of transitioning. Now, the evolution of a dental career, the startup purchase, again, very important that we have these terms that will provide us with the stability and the predictability of the practice. We need a renewal. We need renewal options to extend the life of the lease. We need the ability to expand our office space if there's an option to do so. I know of a lot of associate doctors look to lease space that's 1,000, 1,100 square feet with the plans of one day moving their clinic perhaps to a separate building to lease from another landlord, just as they get the chance to build up a patient base. Well, what if we have the option to expand our practice square footage and we didn't have to move and go through the painful process of finding new space? Well, we should have the option to expand and willingly take over some additional space. And we should be very prepared for what our transition and sale process for the clinic is going to be. Now, just in the interest of time, some of the key takeaways that we have tonight, again, the details in our lease agreement can cost us a lot of money. Just be very, very cautious to some of the language that's been outlined in the contract the landlord may be serving you with, or we may already have in place. We could end up unintentionally leaving a lot of money on the table or in the pockets of a landlord if it's not properly set up from the get-go. Lease agreements, and I hope I've illustrated this properly, is not all about they're not all about rent. Some of the legal provisions that we had discussed can cost us a lot more than what the rental rates in the lease agreement should be. Again, the lease agreement should provide us with a certain amount of flexibility, should add a certain amount of value to the clinic, and provide us some peace of mind when we have the lease in place and not have to worry about the landlord knocking on the door with a potential redevelopment notice. We need to, of course, be strategic and not just forget about what we deserve. We need to constantly remind ourselves of the amount of covenant that a dentist offers a landlord. And that's the true incentive for the landlord to come to the table in a negotiation, because a dentist invests a tremendous amount of money when building out the office space. They sign a very long-term lease, provide the landlord with a very long-term commitment in rent, and attract a great deal of valuable foot traffic to the building. Keeping in mind the tenant lease cycle for those of us with lease contracts in place today, we should start the process as soon as early, again, 2 years prior to the expiration or the option to renew deadline is ideal. If we're looking to lease new space, we should look to negotiate the lease before executing a letter of intent or an offer to lease. And for those of us, again, looking to sell a practice, before trying to identify a buyer, the lease agreement is something that should be set up so that it's going to assist us in that sale. Now, for those of you interested in connecting with myself for a lease review and consultation, we do have a number of complimentary consults that we'll be extending to some of the registrants this evening. So if any of you have questions, I'll open up the Q&A floor now to the chat box there. But should any of you want to connect for a complimentary lease review of your current office lease or a proposed document, please don't hesitate to reach out to me either via phone or email, and we can coordinate a time to speak over the phone together for up to an hour, and prior to that phone call, we'll, on our end, have gone through everything so that you're aware of what's in your potential lease agreement. But thank you. I hope that you've all learned a thing or two about commercial office leasing. And without any further discussion, if there's questions, please don't hesitate to type into the chat box.